Imagine you're on a crowded subway in New York City. Things are tense because another passenger is acting erratically. Would you step in? What's the line between keeping yourself and others safe and taking actions with huge consequences?
That's a question a lot of us probably hope we never have to actually face.
Exactly. Sadly, this isn't just a hypothetical. It became a reality in the case of Daniel Penny, the former Marine. He was charged with manslaughter in the death of Jordan Neely after he used a chokehold on him on a subway train. This case has really gripped the nation, and that's what we're diving into today. We've got excerpts from this Associated Press article. It details a pretty big new development in the trial, and we've got a Reddit thread where, wow, people are really going at it over this
Yeah,
case.
it's a situation that really blurs those lines, ethically, legally.
Yeah.
A real gray area. So what did you find?
Okay, to start, we need to go back to that day on the subway. The AP article talks about how Jordan Neely was yelling, asking for money, making some pretty disturbing statements. Witnesses say different things. Some say he was threatening passengers, and others say he wasn't physically aggressive at all.
It's interesting, right, because those different accounts make it hard to figure out what really happened. How much of a threat was Neely actually posing is a big point of disagreement in the trial.
And then we have Daniel Penny, a former Marine. He steps in, puts Neely in a chokehold. Tragically, the chokehold goes on for minutes, and, well, Neely dies. We know the initial charge against Penny was manslaughter.
Right, which carries a potential sentence of 15 years.
Yeah.
To get that conviction, they'd have to prove that Penny recklessly caused Neely's death.
And now here's the twist. That manslaughter charge was actually dismissed. The jury couldn't agree on a verdict. The judge dismissed it at the prosecutor's request after, I guess, a lot of deliberation.
A deadlocked jury. That's fascinating, isn't it? It means even with all the evidence presented, they couldn't decide if Penny's actions were manslaughter.
It sounds like they really struggled with some of the legal terms. The article mentions they asked for the judge to clarify reasonable person, recklessness, and negligence. They even looked at the video evidence, the testimony, multiple times, trying to figure out that chaotic scene on the subway.
And that's where the whole idea of the story each side tells comes in. The defense, the prosecution, they each built their case on how they saw what happened.
Penny's lawyers were claiming self-defense, right? Saying he was protecting himself, everyone else on the subway, from what they saw as a threat from Neely. They even brought up Neely's past, his mental health issues, and prior assault convictions to strengthen their argument.
Yeah, they really highlighted the perceived threat and the need to act quickly. But on the other side, the prosecution, they focused on whether what Penny did was really called for, was deadly force necessary.
Especially because Neely didn't have a weapon. And the chokehold continued after Neely stopped responding. It's hard to square that with the self-defense claim.
Exactly. They were using those points to say, look, Penny went too far. What he did wasn't just about neutralizing a threat.
This case, it really hit a nerve in society. The article talks about the huge demonstrations outside the courthouse, people on both sides, very passionate, even politicians getting involved.
Oh, absolutely. This case became a flashpoint. It ignited all these discussions we're already having about race, about justice, about mental health in America.
It's impossible to ignore that Penny is white and Neely was black. That brings up the whole issue of racial bias in our justice system.
And on top of that, we have the issue of homelessness and mental health crises, particularly in shared spaces like the subway. How do we deal with that?
This case forced us to look at some realities we'd rather not.
Okay, let's get into that Reddit thread you mentioned. It's a whole mix of opinions, that's for sure. Online discussions like this, they show you just how many different viewpoints people have, especially on a topic like this.
There were people who were 100% behind Penny. They saw him as a good guy trying to protect everyone in a bad situation. They focused on the fear that Neely's behavior probably caused.
A lot of comments stress that idea of individual responsibility, the right to defend yourself. You even saw frustration with how authorities deal with, let's say, potentially dangerous people on the subway. Like, why didn't anyone else do anything?
And then, of course, you had people condemning Penny. They said he went overboard. He used too much force against someone who was already vulnerable.
Their arguments were about the ethics of it all. Is deadly force ever right? Especially when you're dealing with someone who might be in a mental health crisis. The power dynamic, the possibility of misjudging the situation, the fact that taking a life can't be undone. All heavy stuff.
It's like they were looking at the same event through completely different lenses, emphasizing different values.
It shows how our own experiences, our values, they shape how we see these events, especially charged, complex situations like this.
You had some commenters going deep into the law. They were debating if verbal threats alone are enough to justify using lethal force.
That's the core question, isn't it? Legally and ethically, what's the line? When is a threat real enough for self-defense, and when could things have been calmed down without violence?
It gets tricky, right? How do you balance personal safety with the need to help someone who might need help, especially when mental health is involved?
It's a gray area. The law doesn't always give you a clear answer. You have to weigh the situation, the potential danger, the bigger impact of your actions.
The personal stories people shared in the thread, those really got to me. People talking about mental health crises from both sides, seeing it happen, going through it themselves. Some people pushing back against the whole dangerous homeless person stereotype. Others talking about feeling scared, helpless on the subway when someone's acting erratically.
Those personal stories, they ground the debate. It's not just concepts we're talking about, it's real lives.
Definitely adds another layer to it all. One thing that stuck with me from the AP article was Jordan Neely's story.
His story is tragic. It adds yet another layer of complexity to this already complex case.
The article mentions his mother was murdered when he was a teenager, that he struggled with homelessness and mental illness for years. Makes you think about the support systems we have or don't have for people facing those challenges, how we treat the most vulnerable among us.
It's about collective responsibility, isn't it? Are we doing enough to provide mental health services support for those who need it most?
And it makes the question of whether Penny's actions were justified even harder, don't you think?
It does. It's hard to hear about Neely's struggles and not feel for him, for the life he lived.
So that's where the AP article and the Reddit thread leave us. A lot to chew on. But the biggest question remains, what should happen in this trial? What does justice look like in a case as tangled as this one?
It's something to really think about. And we'll keep digging into these issues, going deeper into what we've got in the next part of our deep dive. Welcome back. We're continuing our deep dive into the Daniel Penny trial, trying to sort out the legal and ethical issues this case brings up.
And we're going deeper into those Reddit comments, the ones that were really insightful, the ones that made you think. This case, it really got under people's skin.
Oh, it did. And it makes sense. It touches on things that are so personal, so divisive. And the Reddit thread, it's a window into that whole range of emotions, opinions, you name it.
There was this one comment that stuck with me. It was from someone who rides the subway all the time. They said they see people yelling, acting strangely pretty often, and usually nothing happens. It's just like part of life in New York.
It's a point we often miss when we focus on these big, headline-grabbing cases, right? We zoom in on the extraordinary, but that comment brings us back down to earth. For a lot of people, encountering this kind of behavior, it's normal. Maybe it says something about how much we tolerate, how our tolerance has shifted.
Another user brought up the bystander effect. That whole idea that if there are other people around, you're less likely to step in during a crisis.
That diffusion of responsibility, yeah, like someone else will handle it.
Yeah.
It's a powerful force in social situations, and in this case, with all those witnesses on the subway, it's really relevant. That user wondered, if Penny hadn't done anything, would anyone have stepped in?
It's a disturbing thought, and it leads to those bigger questions like, when is it our responsibility to act in a situation that could be dangerous? And how do you weigh that against your own safety?
A moral dilemma. We all face it. And the answers aren't always simple. The Reddit thread shows that struggle. Some people saying stepping in is a moral must, others saying it's too dangerous.
One commenter said if they had some training like de-escalation techniques or self-defense, they'd be more likely to intervene. They said they felt helpless, uncertain, facing something like Penny did.
I can see that. It highlights the need for people to understand mental health issues better, to have training in crisis intervention, not just for law enforcement, but for everyone. What if more people felt prepared to handle these tough situations? Could it prevent tragedies like this?
Some comments looked at the bigger picture. They weren't as focused on the details of this case, but on the larger issues it brought up.
They talked about the problems with our mental health system, the lack of affordable housing, how we often treat poverty like a crime. These are the underlying problems that lead to these kinds of tragedies.
Someone pointed out that if Neely had access to mental health care, to stable housing, maybe he wouldn't have been on that subway in such a bad state.
It's a painful truth. We failed Jordan Neely as a society.
The political divides, this case really brought those out. The Reddit thread was a reflection of that. People debating everything, from racial bias in the justice system to personal responsibility in solving these big societal problems.
It reminds us this case is about more than a verdict. It's a reflection of who we are, what we believe in, what we fear, what kind of world we want.
Even with all the arguments, the disagreements, there were moments where people showed empathy, understanding.
There were. Some couldn't imagine the pain Neely's family must be going through no matter what. Someone else, who said they struggled with mental illness, urged people to be compassionate.
It's a reminder that even when we disagree, we can still connect as humans.
That shared humanity, that's maybe the most important thing here. We might not agree on this case, the laws, the politics of it all, but we can at least try to see each other's side, understand how complex it is, and work towards a society that values justice, compassion, and well-being for everyone.
That's powerful. Before we wrap up, we have to go back to the legal side of things. The AP article talked about a lesser charge the judge let the jury think about after they couldn't agree on manslaughter. Criminally negligent homicide.
Right, that's a big development.
To be honest, I'm a bit confused about that. What exactly is criminally negligent homicide, and how is it different from the manslaughter charge?
Well, we talked about how for manslaughter, they'd have to prove Penny acted recklessly, knowing his actions could kill. That carries up to 15 years.
But this criminally negligent homicide, it's a lower bar, right?
In a way, yes. It's about doing something the law calls seriously blameworthy, but you're not aware of the risk of death. It's about not taking reasonable care, even if you don't specifically see the danger. It's a subtle but crucial difference.
So they're not saying Penny knew he could kill Neely, but that he should have known, given everything that was happening.
Exactly. That change is important because it might be easier for the jury to say he's guilty, and the article mentions the potential sentence is a lot lighter, probation to a max of 4 years.
Sounds like the prosecution wants to hold Penny accountable, even if it's not for the original, more serious charge. They realize the jury struggled with manslaughter, but they still think he should face consequences.
It's a strategy, and it makes you think about what justice really means. Is a lesser conviction better than no conviction at all?
That's a tough one. Brings us back to our main question. After everything we've talked about, the facts, the legal arguments, what people are saying, the ethics of it all, what do you think should happen in this trial? What does justice look like in this incredibly complicated, emotional case?
That's a question that needs real thought. We have to consider the legal principles, the ethical issues, and the human cost of this tragedy. It's a question we'll keep exploring as this case moves forward.
Definitely more to unpack. In part 3, we'll look at the bigger picture, the impact this case will have on society, and the questions it raises for all of us. Welcome back to our deep dive on the Daniel Penny trial. We've gone over the facts, the legal arguments, the public reactions, even what people are saying online. But now we need to talk about the lasting impact. What does this case tell us about where we are as a society, the issues we have, the questions we should be asking?
This case didn't just happen in a courtroom. It happened in a society that's already dealing with a lot. Social tensions, worries about safety, the mental health crisis. It's all there.
It feels like this case forced us to look at some uncomfortable truths, things we usually try to ignore.
It did. And it started conversations that go way beyond the courts. Conversations about race, class, privilege, who's responsible for what does justice actually mean? It's all connected.
One big theme was this tension between individual rights and what's good for everyone. We want to feel safe, protect ourselves, especially in public, but we also need to care for people who are struggling, show compassion, and try to fix the things that cause these problems in the first place.
Penny's supporters said he was a good guy, just trying to protect himself and others from danger. They focused on individual responsibility, the right to defend yourself.
But people supporting Neely saw it differently. They focused on the bigger issues, like poverty, homelessness, not having access to mental health care. They said those were the real reasons this happened. They talked about needing solutions as a society, being more compassionate about mental health.
It's that classic struggle, right? The
Yeah.
individual versus the group. Personal responsibility versus what we owe to each other. This case didn't give us easy answers. It just showed how divided we are on these issues.
Another thing we saw a lot was the power of narratives. How we tell the story, the words we use, whose perspective we focus on, it all shapes how we understand things, how we judge.
The Penny trial was all about competing narratives. The defense, they painted Penny as a hero, a veteran who stepped in to save people from a dangerous man. The prosecution, they focused on Neely, how vulnerable he was, the fact that he had mental health issues, and how much force was used against him.
And then you have the media, social media, those Reddit threads, everyone adding their voice. It all influences what people think.
It reminds us how powerful stories are. We have to think critically. We have to recognize that people have biases, agendas, and those shape the information we get. We need to be careful, question what we're told, look for different perspectives, and form our own opinions based on the evidence.
Speaking of evidence, this case showed us how hard it is to make sense of a world full of video footage. What happened on that subway was filmed from different angles, and those videos were crucial, both in court and in the public debate.
But as we saw in those Reddit comments, even video can be interpreted in different ways. People see what they want to see. They focus on things that fit their beliefs.
It's a reminder that even something that seems objective, like video, can be subjective. We have to remember that video doesn't tell the whole story. It can be manipulated, and context is everything.
This case leaves us with a sense of unease, I think, especially about safety, especially in big cities like New York.
There's a real feeling of fear, of being vulnerable. Like danger is everywhere, and the systems we have to keep us safe aren't ready to deal with mental health crises, with keeping order in public spaces.
And that fear, it gets worse with all the media coverage, social media. It makes people more watchful, suspicious, and it makes them focus on their own safety, maybe even at the expense of compassion.
So where do we go from here? What can we learn from this whole situation?
I think the most important thing is to have honest, open conversations about these issues. We have to address the root causes of things like poverty, homelessness, mental illness. We need to invest in mental health services, give real help to people who need it, and build communities where everyone feels safe and valued.
We need better ways to deal with mental health crises, especially in public. This case showed us that we can't just rely on the police for these situations. It's too complex.
It's about finding a balance, protecting the public while respecting individual rights. It's about knowing when to step in, when to offer help, when to be compassionate. We need to train people, first responders, social workers, even everyday people, to calm things down, offer support, and get people the resources they need.
That's a big challenge.
It is, but we can't ignore it. The Penny trial was a wake-up call. It showed us how precious life is, that our choices have real consequences, and that we need to change things.
It also reminded us that we all have a part to play in building a better world, a world that's more just, compassionate, and fair. We have to challenge our own biases, speak up for those who need help, and demand better from our leaders and institutions.
Those are important things to remember.
They are. This deep dive has taken us through a lot. Emotions, legal stuff, thought-provoking ideas. We hope it's made you think critically, grapple with the hard questions this case brought up.
Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about Daniel Penny and Jordan Neely. It's about all of us. It's about the kind of society we want and the values we believe in.
And those are things worth thinking about, even after this deep dive is over. Thanks for joining us.